Ever feel like uh, you're just kind of going through the motions?
Yeah.
Like the daily grind is all there is.
Yeah. I think we've all been there.
Yeah. Well, today we're diving into a perspective that might just change that.
Yeah.
Finding God in the everyday,
Hmm.
especially when life gets tough.
Right.
Our source is the Faith Beams podcast.
Oh, I love that podcast.
Yeah, and their message is all about that practical, like down-to-earth faith.
It's really refreshing.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, because they just acknowledge that most of us aren't, living on mountaintops, having these grand spiritual revelations.
Right.
We're dealing with bills and work stress and, maybe health issues
Yeah.
and that's where faith needs to meet us.
It's got to be real.
Yes, exactly.
Like it can't just be the Sunday only thing.
Right.
So they start with this idea that really struck me.
Okay.
God sees your struggles, not just in a vague cosmic sense, but the actual nitty-gritty of your day.
I love that. That's so powerful.
And they bring up that analogy of the birds from Matthew 6.26.
Right.
If God is taking care of them, and we're, a bit higher up on that whole creation ladder,
Yeah.
it suggests a level of attentiveness that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost too comforting.
How do you mean?
Because then it's like, well, if God's got it handled,
Mm-hmm.
why am I still stressing?
Oh, that's a great point. And that's where the idea of trust comes in. It's not about passive acceptance, but more like,
Right.
okay, God sees this mess, but how do I invite him into it? How do I work with him on this?
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So it's less about God magically fixing things and more about how our perspective shifts when we know he's present even in the tough stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
And a perfect example of that is how they talk about finances.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, who doesn't worry about money at some point?
But still.
And they bring up Philippians 4.19, where God promises to provide for our needs.
See, I've heard that verse a lot, but I always get stuck on what needs actually means.
Yeah.
Is it just the bare minimum to survive?
Right.
Or is there more to it?
That's the nuance they dig into, which I appreciate.
Right.
It's not about God guaranteeing us a mansion and a yacht,
Okay.
It's about trusting that whatever we truly need, and that includes emotional and spiritual needs, he'll provide.
So how do we tell the difference between a need and just something we want?
Right.
I mean, I need that new phone. Or do I?
That's where the discernment comes in.
Right.
It's a constant conversation with God asking, is this truly essential for my well-being?
Right.
Or am I just caught up in the consumerism whirlwind?
And maybe by asking that question, we're already shifting,
Yes.
from that frantic, like,
Yeah.
I got to get this to a place of like, okay, God, you see this desire.
Uh-huh.
Help me understand if it's aligned with your plan for me.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
Imagine applying that to a real life situation.
Right.
Say you're behind on rent and you're freaking out
No, yeah.
instead of spiraling, You pray, God, I need your guidance here.
Right.
Show me how to handle this responsibly.
That's powerful.
It's interesting because even if the answer isn't money magically appearing,
Right.
maybe it's the peace to approach the situation rationally,
Exactly.
or the idea to reach out for help, which you wouldn't have done if you were just panicking.
Right.
And that brings us to another area where that perspective shift is huge.
Okay.
Our work, whether
Yeah.
it's feeling stuck or undervalued or even looking for a job, it's easy to let that define our worth.
Absolutely. Oh, tell me about it.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
But the podcast reminds us
Uh-huh.
that our value comes from being God's creation,
Yes.
which is kind of a radical thought when you're stuck in a soul-crushing job.
It is. And they use that verse from Colossians 3.23,
Yeah, okay.
where it talks about working wholeheartedly as if working for the Lord,
Right.
not for human masters.
I admit sometimes I read those verses and think,
Mm.
easy for you to say, Paul, you weren't stuck in a cubicle farm,
Right. Right.
but maybe he's getting at something deeper here.
He is.
Yeah.
It's about finding that internal shift.
Right.
Maybe you're not in your dream job yet,
Yeah.
but can you approach your tasks with a sense of offering it up? Like, God, I'm doing this as unto you, even if it feels meaningless right now.
That's a challenging perspective,
It is.
but I see how it could change things.
Yeah.
If it's not just about impressing my boss,
Right.
but doing my best because ultimately it's for God. That's a whole different motivation.
It is, and it takes the pressure off in a way.
It does.
Because your worth isn't tied to your job title or salary anymore.
Yeah.
It's about being a faithful steward of the gifts God's given you, even if the world doesn't recognize it yet.
So it's not settling for mediocrity,
Right.
but finding meaning in the midst of it. Knowing that God sees the effort,
Yes.
the intention behind it. And that leads me to think about another tough area.
Okay.
Health challenges.
Right.
Whether it's our own or someone we love. It can be so draining.
Absolutely. And they share Psalm 73.26.
Okay.
Where the writer says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." It's so raw and honest, right?
Yeah.
It acknowledges that we will have times of weakness.
But there's something defiant in it too.
Yeah.
Like even if everything falls apart, God is still there. That's got to be incredibly comforting when you're facing a serious diagnosis
Yes.
or caring for someone who's ill.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that idea of shifting our reliance. We can't always be strong,
Right.
but we can lean on God's strength when ours runs out.
So it's not about denying the pain or pretending it's easy,
Right.
but saying, okay, God, I'm bringing this to you.
Yes.
I need your strength to get through this. And maybe that strength comes in the form of peace,
Yeah.
courage, or even just the ability to keep going one day at a time.
That's a great point.
You know?
Yeah, because finding God in the everyday isn't about avoiding the tough stuff. It's about facing it with Him by our side.
And that brings us to the overarching theme of the episode,
Okay.
which is God's faithfulness through it all.
Right.
Life throws curveballs. That's a given.
It does.
But Faith Beams podcast reminds us that God's love and presence are constant.
Yes. They highlight Romans 8.28.
Okay.
That all things work together for good.
Right.
For those who love God.
You know, I know that verse can be tough to grasp,
Yeah.
especially when you're in the middle of something awful.
It is. It is.
It's easy to say, well, if this is for my good, I'd hate to see what bad looks like.
Yeah.
But maybe it's less about every situation having a happy ending
Right.
and more about God using even the hard stuff to shape us, to bring us closer to Him.
That's a much more helpful way to look at it. Yeah.
It's not that suffering is good,
right.
but that God can bring good out of it,
Yeah.
even if we don't see it right away.
And that requires a level of trust that goes beyond our current circumstances.
It's
saying, okay, God, I don't understand this right now, but I trust that you have a plan.
Yeah.
And you're with me through it.
Yes.
You know?
Absolutely. It's freeing, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Like we don't have to have all the answers
right.
or figure everything out on our own.
That's a huge relief, especially for someone like me who likes to be in control.
Oh.
I hear that. But giving up that control, surrendering it to God feels vulnerable.
It does. But there's also incredible strength in that vulnerability. It's like saying, God, I can't do this alone.
Right.
I need your help. And that act of surrender opens up space for Him to work
right.
in ways we couldn't even imagine.
So it's not about becoming passive, giving up responsibility.
Right.
But more about recognizing our limitations.
And inviting God into the equation.
Precisely. And that leads to a point the Faith Beams podcast makes that I find really compelling. It's not just about knowing God is with us,
right,
but actively inviting His presence into those everyday moments.
That sounds good in theory, but how do we actually do that?
Right.
I mean, should I be having a theological debate with my coaster in the morning?
Well, maybe not the toaster,
Yeah.
but they suggest starting each day with prayer.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be an hour-long theological dissertation.
Right.
Just a simple acknowledgement of God's presence, a surrender of the day to Him, asking for His guidance.
I can see how that could set a different tone for the day.
Right.
Instead of waking up with a to-do list a mile long and already feeling stressed.
Yeah.
It's more like, okay, God, you're here, I'm here, let's do this together.
Exactly. It's like a mental shift, a conscious decision to invite God into the driver's seat.
I like that.
So to speak.
That reminds me of what we talked about earlier with finances.
Yes.
It's that same idea of surrendering our worries instead of carrying the weight of everything on our shoulders.
Yeah.
We're giving those burdens to God.
And that ties into this whole concept of trust we keep coming back to.
Right.
It's not about denying our struggles or pretending everything is fine.
Right.
But choosing to approach them with faith instead of fear.
I get that, but there's still this part of me that's like, But what if God doesn't come through? What if things don't work out?
Those are valid questions.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to acknowledge those doubts. Faith isn't about blindly ignoring reality.
Right.
It's about choosing to believe in God's goodness, even when we don't understand what's happening.
So it's more about holding those two things in tension.
Yes.
The uncertainty of the situation and the unwavering belief that God is ultimately in control.
That's a great way to put it. And one of the most practical things the podcast suggests is looking for God in the small moments. It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture, the problems, the to-do lists,
Right.
that we miss those little glimmers of grace.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that.
Yeah.
It's like I'm rushing through life with blinders on, focused on getting things done,
Right.
that I don't even notice the beauty of a sunset or the kindness of a stranger.
And those small moments can be such powerful reminders of God's presence. It's like, he's whispering, I'm here, even in this.
So instead of waiting for some big dramatic sign or miracle, it's more about cultivating an awareness of those little whispers, those tiny but significant moments that reveal God's hand at work.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about shifting our perspective from what we lack to what we already have.
Right.
The abundance of blessings that are often overlooked.
That makes me think about those times when I'm feeling overwhelmed and discouraged.
Yeah.
Maybe that's when I need to just stop, take a breath, and look around for those little God moments.
That's a great idea. It's about training our minds to focus on the good, to find those glimpses of hope and beauty, even in the midst of chaos.
It's like a spiritual scavenger hunt.
Exactly.
Looking for those hidden treasures
that
remind us of God's love and presence.
I like that.
It's less about trying to force something to happen.
Right.
And more about being open to seeing what's already there.
And the more we do that, the more attuned we become to God's presence in every aspect of our lives. It's not about compartmentalizing faith into Sunday mornings or specific prayer times, but integrating it into the fabric of our everyday existence.
So it's about living with this underlying awareness.
Yes.
That God is involved, even in the most mundane things.
Right.
And that changes how we approach everything.
That's right. It's about moving beyond simply believing in God to actually experiencing his presence in a tangible, real way, day in and day out.
Yeah, it's like we're moving from theory to practice,
Absolutely.
From head knowledge to heart knowledge.
Yes.
And that's where the real transformation happens.
It's where it's at, yeah.
And that's what I appreciate about how the Faith News podcast wraps up this episode.
Yeah.
They don't just leave us with all these great ideas and say, good luck with that.
Exactly. Because it would be kind of overwhelming.
Right.
To think, okay, I have to completely overhaul my life and become this super spiritual person overnight.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
No.
So instead, they offer this simple but powerful challenge.
Okay, I like it.
Find one small way to invite God's presence into your daily routine this week.
I love that.
It feels doable.
Yeah.
It's not about trying to be perfect or achieve some unattainable level of holiness.
Right.
But just taking one small step in the right direction.
What's fascinating is how that one small step can have a ripple effect.
Oh, totally.
It might be something as simple as starting your day with a quick prayer.
Right.
But that sets the tone for everything that follows.
It's like those moments in a movie.
Yeah.
Where the main character makes a decision.
Uh-huh.
And it sets off this chain of events that changes everything.
That's a great analogy. And even if we don't see those dramatic results right away, those small acts of faith are still making a difference. They're shaping our hearts, our minds, our very being.
It's like we're slowly rewiring our internal circuitry.
Yes.
Moving from a default setting of fear and anxiety to one of trust and surrender.
Exactly. And that's a process, not a destination.
Yeah.
There will be days when we nail it and days when we completely forget to even acknowledge God's presence.
And I think it's important to have that grace for ourselves.
Yes.
To recognize that we're all works in progress.
Absolutely. And the beauty is that God meets us right where we are in all our imperfections.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one small step you're thinking about taking this week?
Oh, that's a great question.
What's one tiny but intentional way you can invite God into the everyday?
For me, it's been about being more mindful of my words. It's so easy to get caught up in complaining or negativity.
Yeah.
So I'm challenging myself to speak words of life and encouragement instead.
I love that.
Even if it's just a simple compliment to a stranger.
Right.
Or a heartfelt thank you to a coworker.
Yeah.
I want my words to reflect God's love and light.
That's beautiful. And it makes me think about how my small step could be.
Yeah.
Simply pausing for a moment of gratitude before I dive into my to-do list each morning.
Oh, nice.
Just acknowledging the good things in my life, big or small,
Yeah.
and thanking God for them.
I love that.
I know.
It doesn't have to be anything fancy or complicated.
Right.
It's the intention behind it that matters.
Right. It's about those small, consistent choices that add up over time. It's about making God a part of our daily rhythm, not just an occasional visitor.
And as we do that, we'll discover that even the most ordinary days can be filled with extraordinary moments of grace
Right.
and connection with the divine.
So let's go out there and find those moments.
Yes.
Those little sparks of God's presence in the everyday.
Absolutely.
And let's encourage each other along the way.
Yes, let's do that.
Because sometimes we all need that reminder that we're not alone in this journey.